nature of that threat remains a significant concern. After 9/11, we were primarily focused on an externally directed attack capability emanating from a single piece of real estate along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. 18 years later, as my colleagues have noted, we face a homegrown violent extremist threat, almost 20 ISIS branches and networks that range from tens to hundreds to thousands of people, Al-Qaeda and its branches and affiliates, foreign fighters that flock to Iraq and Syria from well over 100 countries, Iran and its proxies, and there is a growing terrorist threat from racially and ethnically motivated extremists around the globe. By any calculation, there are far more radicalized individuals now than there were at 9/11, and this highlights the importance of terrorism prevention. While some aspects of the threat can only be dealt with through kinetic operations, the resonance of the ideology will not be dealt with by military or law enforcement operations alone. The world has a lot of work to do in the non-kinetic realm to deal with radicalization and underlying causes. The second challenge stems from terrorists' ability to exploit technology and the attributes of globalization. They are good at it, and they're very innovative, as the chairman suggested. We have seen the use of encrypted communications for operational planning, the use of social media to spread propaganda and transfer knowledge between and amongst individuals and networks, the use of drones and UASs for swarm attacks, explosive delivery means, and even assassination attempts. High-quality fraudulent travel documents will increasingly undermine a names-based screening and vetting system and threaten border security. We will see greater use of cryptocurrencies to fund operations, and the potential terrorist use of chemical and biological weapons has moved from a low probability eventuality to something that is considered much more likely. In many cases, terrorist exploitation of technology has outpaced the associated legal and policy framework needed to deal with the threat. Looking out 5 years, we are particularly concerned with the growing adverse impact encryption will have on our counterterrorism efforts. And the third challenge I'd highlight relates to a concern about potential complacency. Our whole-of-government approach to counterterrorism over the past 18 years has kept the country pretty safe. In our view, the near-term potential for large-scale, externally directed attacks against the homeland has at least temporarily declined as a result of U.S. and allied actions around the globe. But as noted earlier, the threat itself does continue to metastasize and will require very close attention in the years ahead. In a crowded national security environment, it is completely understandable that terrorism may no longer be viewed as the #1 threat to the country. But that begs a host of questions. First, what does the national risk equation look like as the country confronts a very complex national security environment? Secondly, how do we optimize CT resources in the best interest of the country when departments and agencies may have somewhat differing priorities? And thirdly, if we're going to reduce efforts against terrorism, how do we do so in a manner that doesn't inadvertently reverse the gains of the past 18 years? These are all complicated questions that will require significant conversation, sophisticated conversation going forward in both the executive and legislative branches. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Travers. Now, I wasn't expecting an infusion of optimism here, and I didn't get it. These are serious threats, and they are becoming more and more complex. You know, one thing I noticed in what was lacking in all of your written testimony as well as your oral testimony, except for Undersecretary Glawe did reference the murder of the Mormon family. We didn't talk about the really incredible events surrounding the capture of El Chapo's son and how the drug cartels completely took over and overwhelmed the law enforcement there. So, and we didn't talk about, and this is the thing that was really missing, we didn't talk about MS-13 and some of those gangs that are infusing our inner cities and are incredibly brutal. So I guess I'd just like to ask all three of you either the reality, the potential for spillover of the drug cartel activities we saw with El Chapo's son, as we saw with the Mormon tragedy, but also just the gangs that we already know exist, and really the current situation. Is it growing? How much of a handle do we have on these gangs? I'll start with you, Mr. Glawe.
Chairman Johnson, thank you for the opportunity to speak about this. I would say regarding to Mexico, there are areas in Mexico which I would characterize as lawless. Lawless being that the drug cartels run the infrastructure, the services, and their businesses, which is drug trafficking.
I've heard of, and I want you to, I don't want to name the figure, but I've heard a pretty high percentage of the number of communities are completely controlled by the drug cartels.
We have done an evaluation with other U.S. intelligence community partners, and I'd be happy to come back in a closed session. I believe that's classified, and we can go through that. But we did do an evaluation similar to a counterinsurgency model that we've looked at in the war zones. And it is devastating right now. The numbers of our interdicting drug traffic or drugs on the southwest border has increased statistically over the last 3 years. Methamphetamine, fentanyl-based narcotics, opium-based narcotics, and cocaine. Their networks are sophisticated. They operate as a sophisticated business and enterprise with a supply chain, with covert and overt operatives. They're able to use extortion and assassinations at will. It is all based on money and moving people and goods to the southwest border and over the border into the United States. And those supply lanes and drug trafficking routes are defined, and where there's not, there's war and there's fighting going on.
So we held a hearing in MS-13. It was not motivated by drugs. It was something else. Director Wray, can you kind of speak to gangs in our inner cities?
Well, certainly the FBI is spending a lot of our effort on gangs in the inner cities, not just MS-13, 18th Street, gangs like that have a more national footprint, but also neighborhood gangs. If you talk to police chiefs around this country, you will find that in a lot of cities, it's neighborhood gangs that are really terrorizing the communities. And we view it as a threat that is unfortunately alive and well, and we're tackling it through a variety of different kinds of task forces, capacity building with state and locals.
What's been the trend over the last 10 years?
Well, I think part of it is this trend towards the neighborhood gangs. You know, MS-13 has continued to become a major factor, but we also, like I said, are increasingly worried about neighborhood gangs. We have found that when you, in a coordinated way, are strategic and prioritized in going after the threats, in a lot of communities, what you will find is that if you prioritize, you will find that there's, in effect, a tail wagging the dog, and it varies from city to city. But in one city, it'll be a particular neighborhood. In another city, it might even be a 6-block radius. In another place, it might be a particular corridor on a highway. Another place might be a particular group, 20 or 30 people who are really driving the threat. But there's almost always, with good intelligence analysis, working together with our partners, you will find, again, that tail wagging the dog. And if you're disciplined in going after it, you can have a dramatic impact, sometimes quite quickly, that lasts.
But are the number of gang members growing? Are the actions becoming more brutal? I mean, I read about things that are just horrific.
Well, certainly MS-13 takes brutality to a whole nother level. Violence there, as you know, Mr. Chairman, is essentially part of a rite of passage to join and move up the ranks. And so there's a degree to which there's really almost violence for violence sake in the part of some of these gangs.
But again, are the numbers growing, or is it flat? Or I'm just trying to get a feel for the trend here.
I'm not sure I can give you the numbers of gang membership per se, but I'd be happy to have someone follow up with you and give you a more detailed briefing on that. I know the violent crime rate has gone down some in the last year or two, even though not dramatically, it's gone in the right direction.
In your testimony, your oral testimony, Director Wray, you were talking about the cyber theft, which is, I've heard hundreds of billions of dollars. Primarily, the big culprit there is China. I can't personally envision a trade deal reining that in. I think we're going to have to use law enforcement. And I think we're going to have to use law enforcement from the standpoint of having global partners, for example, deny entry from management of these companies that we know are stealing our intellectual property. Can you just kind of speak to that reality?
I think you're exactly right that there's no one remedy that's going to deal with a threat that is this broad, this deep, this diverse, this vexing. What I would say is that there's a role for trade, there's a role for law enforcement, there's a role for diplomacy, there's a role for, in particular, as I think you and I have discussed in the past, building resilience in this country about working with the private sector and the academic sector. A lot of times the most effective defense against the Chinese counterintelligence threat can be done by companies and universities and other institutions in this country being smarter and more sophisticated about protecting themselves. And so we're putting a lot of effort into that, being a little more forward-leaning than we might have been 5 or 6 years ago in terms of providing detailed information to try to help them, as I said, be part of the common defense that I think we all need.
You know, Canada arrested the CFO of Huawei in charges related to violation of sanctions. Is there a considered effort to try and, again, deny entry, potentially arrest people from these, these companies that are stealing our intellectual property? I mean, is there an organized effort globally with other Western democracies to do that?
Well, we are doing things with other Western countries and, frankly, non-Western countries, because this is a threat that is being confronted by a lot of our allies. I will say that in some instances there are abuses of the visa process that we're trying to help address. It's obviously a State Department issue, but they're an important part of this fight as well. In other cases, there may be people who are engaged in intellectual property theft in a way that violates the terms of their contract, either an employment contract in a company or a research contract with a university, and they can be essentially kicked out on that basis. And sometimes that's a lot better solution than traditional law enforcement.
Okay, Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, there's no question the three of you have very difficult jobs and big responsibilities. Mr. Glau, I want to discuss one of those very difficult jobs that the Department of Homeland Security has, which is, of course, what all three of you do. First and foremost, keep us safe. That's the fundamental objective, is to make sure that Americans are safe. But you have an added responsibility, and that is to move trade and commerce as efficiently as possible across the borders. And those two are often at odds with each other. And certainly in Michigan, it's something that we look at a lot, given the fact that we have two of the three busiest land crossings, border crossings in the country. And so the facilitation of secure trade and travel is absolutely essential to my state as well as many others. In order to support that mission, it's crucial that the DHS has a clear picture of the threats facing the northern border and between the ports of entry as well. So my question to you is, could you briefly speak to INA's work to assess the threats on the northern border to support the Department's northern border strategy as it exists today?
Sure. Ranking Member Peters, thank you for the question. And I'm a relatively unique witness for you. So I was the head of intelligence for U.S. Customs and Border Protection prior to me assuming this role, and I occupied that for almost 3 years. And in that role, I led a team that did a assessment of the northern border threat, which I'll be happy to share with the committee, or actually that'd be U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And I've traveled to the northern border. I've been to Detroit. I've been to those land border crossings, and I've been to our intelligence center, which we have stood up there. There is a vulnerability in the marine environment and the land environment. It is a porous border, and the terrain is tough, as it is on the southwest border, but different. We are looking at how we deploy our assets, which are primarily law enforcement, in the air and sensor capability to see individuals that may be crossing unlawfully. A lot of our relationship revolves around partnership with the Canadians, the Canadian Border Service and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and their intelligence services, which are outstanding. But we are very much relying on that partnership with each other. But backed up by the good intelligence collection by our partners is critical to that, and it goes on 24 hours a day. And I would like to highlight the National Vetting Center, which is our global capability to identify at-risk individuals, which is also being expanded to cargo that pose a threat to the United States. And that is in full operational capacity now through our National Targeting Center at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. But we are constantly evaluating the threat to the northern border by transnational criminal organizations, terrorist organizations, and foreign intelligence officers.
Thank you. Mr. Wray, I mentioned this briefly in my opening comments, but your agency has not provided a single document in almost 6 months now to a letter that Chairman Johnson and I authored dealing with domestic terrorism. And this is a bipartisan letter. I think we were very careful in terms of the scope of it, that it's not overly broad, but got hopefully allowed us to have the kind of information necessary for us to provide the kind of oversight, particularly on something as serious as domestic terrorism and white supremacist action in particular, which you've highlighted as something that is growing. To me, and I think I'm speaking for my chairman as well, is that that's unacceptable when you have a joint letter from a ranking member and the chairman, bipartisan. My question to you is, do you require a subpoena to respond to routine document requests from this committee?
No. Second, I would tell you, Ranking Member Peters, Mr. Senator, that we have tried very hard to be responsive to this committee. I will say that I know that the department, of which we are, of course, a part, provided a long written response. I know that we sat down with your staff, the committee staff, and provided a verbal briefing, which was very helpful on our end in understanding better the purpose and the scope and the intent of the request. I also know that we have been providing monthly domestic terrorism reports to the committee staff, among others. So, but having said that, the most important thing to me is to make sure that we're being responsive, and I will direct my staff to drill in and figure out how we can be more responsive and more forthcoming in response to your request.
So you'll be more responsive than not responding at all?
Well, as I said, Senator, I think we have been
But we
responsive.
haven't. I mean, you talk about the committee gives response. We actually talked about this last week. What we got from DHS were basically publicly available documents. I will tell you, our staffs are pretty good at looking at publicly available documents, so that's not real helpful in our oversight role. These were very specific questions that we would expect a response, and we believe that we should probably have, as a committee, and it's my question, do you think the committee should have less access to documents than just a general FOIA request? That's basically what we're seeing here.
Well, Senator, I can't speak for DHS's
No,
response,
for the FBI.
but I can't. But from the FBI, as I said, I don't think providing verbal briefing, the written response from the department, and the monthly reports is no response at all. The point, though, from my perspective, is that I want to make sure we're addressing your concerns. So I don't want you to take any of my responses suggesting that I'm not going to direct my staff to drill back down and make sure that we're doing everything we can to be cooperative.
Well, I appreciate that. Can we get a commitment by the end of the week that we would have that?
Well, we get some kind of response by the end of the week. I need to get more information about what's missing and what's still needed.
I appreciate that, and I hope you have prompt attention to that. According to the FBI, domestic terrorists killed 39 people in fiscal year 2019, making it the most deadly year for domestic terrorism since the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. My question to you, Mr. Wray, is how would you characterize the domestic terrorist threat posed by white supremacists?
So first I would say that domestic terrorism generally, in particular self-radicalized, typically lone actors here, represents a serious, persistent threat. I think we had about 107 domestic terrorism arrests in fiscal year 19, which is close to the same number that we had on the international terrorism front. Within the domestic terrorism group, and we have about, at any given time, the number fluctuates, but at any given time, we have about 1,000, sometimes it's closer to 900, sometimes it's above 1,000 domestic terrorism investigations. A huge chunk of those domestic terrorism investigations involve racially motivated, violent, extremist motivated terrorist attacks. And the majority of those, of the racially motivated, violent, extremist attacks, are fueled by some kind of white supremacy. And I would say that the most lethal activity over the last few years has been committed by those type of attackers.
I'm out of time, but I will follow this in the second round. Thank
Senator
you.
Hassan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you and Ranking Member Peters for convening this hearing on threats to our homeland. Thank you to all three of our witnesses, not only for being here today, but for your service to our country. And I hope you will carry back with you to the men and women you lead our sincere thanks from a grateful country for all they do to keep us safe. Director Travers, I wanted to start with a question to you. Last month, I traveled to Afghanistan and Pakistan and heard firsthand the concerns of our military and embassy personnel about the growing and very real threat of ISIS-K, the ISIS affiliate in Afghanistan. I heard clearly that ISIS-K threatens not only U.S. forces in Afghanistan, but also has designs on striking the U.S. homeland. You said last week that there are more than 20 ISIS branches globally, some of which are using sophisticated technology such as drones to conduct operations. Despite our key victories against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, ISIS as a global terrorist organization remains a deadly threat to the United States. Director Travers, we know that ISIS-K and other affiliates of ISIS want to strike the U.S. homeland. Please tell us more about their ability to do this and what we are doing to mitigate this threat.
Thanks for the question, Senator. Yes, of all of the branches and networks of ISIS, ISIS-K is certainly one of those of most concern. Probably in the neighborhood of 4,000 individuals or so. We certainly share the concerns of both the U.S. military and the embassy in theater. They have attempted to certainly inspire attacks outside of Afghanistan. They attempted last year to conduct a suicide attack in India. It failed. They've actually tried a couple of years ago, I think, to inspire an attack against New York that the FBI interrupted. And there was an attack in Stockholm in 2017, I believe, that killed 5 people. So they certainly have got a desire, and the propaganda would indicate that they want to conduct attacks outside of Afghanistan, thus far relatively limited. I would say that we saw attack claims by ISIS-K ramping up throughout 16, 17, 18, somewhat lower at the beginning of this year, although now I think we're looking at about an attack a day or so. Yeah. And interestingly, only about an hour and a half ago, they were the latest ISIS branch to declare allegiance to the new head of ISIS.
Thank you for that. Director Wray, I have a question for you about ransomware, but just before I do, I wanted to thank your team in New Hampshire. We recently had a field hearing about the threats to our houses of worship, in particular from domestic terrorism, and Supervisory Senior Resident Agent Michael Gibley was very helpful, and I think our leaders, our faith leaders, have been very encouraged by his work with them, so thank you and him for that. As to ransomware, we are seeing the impact of it across the country, including an attack in my home state of New Hampshire. Threat actors target every aspect of our communities, from healthcare providers to our small businesses, and even to state and local governments themselves, as they did in New Hampshire. Last week, I talked with CISA Director Krebs about what the Department of Homeland Security is doing to assist state and local entities facing ransomware attacks. Director Wray, what is the FBI doing to address the threat of ransomware attacks on our communities? Is it tracking the number of ransomware attacks on our country? And how is the FBI coordinating with Department of Homeland Security in these efforts?
So first off, Senator, appreciate the feedback on the meeting up in New Hampshire. On ransomware specifically, I think what we're seeing is a shift to more and more targeted ransomware attacks, more and more targeting, for example, municipalities, and there are a variety of reasons why municipalities are particularly vulnerable victims to ransomware attacks. We are also seeing more enterprise-level ransomware attacks, where it essentially affects every computer in the organization. One of the things that we're trying to do wherever we can is figure out through our unique role as both a law enforcement agency and an intelligence agency. There have been times where, for example, we're able to reverse engineer a decryption key. So I can think, for example, we had a case in the Northwest, for example, small business, 600 people, crippling ransomware attack, potentially all those people about to lose their jobs, the company to go under. But because of our investigative work, we were able to reverse engineer a decryption key. They didn't have to pay the ransom. They got their systems back online, and a lot of nice thank you notes from those 600 employees. As far as working with DHS, the basic lanes in the road, if you will, we work very closely together. The FBI is the lead on the threat, and DHS is the lead on the asset, and essentially we work together in that respect.
Okay. It's something that I think in a lot of the work we've done as a committee, we are hearing more and more concern from our local stakeholders about it, and also really want to help all of the various agencies coordinate and share information as effectively as possible. Director Travers, I wanted to go back to the issue of domestic terrorism. In the aftermath of 9/11, the federal government built a robust and capable counterterrorism architecture, establishing new departments, centers, and counterterrorism information sharing mechanisms to support state and local partners and address a foreign terrorist attack threat unlike any we had seen before. Today, 18 years later, we face a surge in domestic terrorism, and you'll hear it from everybody on this committee. You've heard it already in some of the questions, including rising threats against houses of worship. If we are to prevent domestic terrorist attacks, we have to start treating these incidents as seriously as we did when al-Qaeda and other foreign terrorist organizations have threatened or attacked us after 9/11. Director Travers, the National Counterterrorism Center was created after 9/11 to respond to threats from al-Qaeda. The center is responsible for ensuring that we effectively integrate and share terrorist-related information in order to prevent attacks. Can you share your thoughts on the current state of domestic terrorism information sharing? What does the U.S. government need to do amid this rising threat to ensure that intelligence isn't missed and that it gets to the people who need to know it?
I'll start, but I think probably pass it to Director Wray. The Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act that created NCTC, written by this committee, gave a number of statutory responsibilities to NCTC in the realm of international terrorism. There are references in the legislation to domestic terrorism, but quite clearly the Bureau would have the lead, and I view NCTC as being in support. So we have I think a lot of things we can do, and our staffs are working on sort of laying out the parameters, but things like addressing issues of radicalization and mobilization, kind of left-to-boom kinds of questions that NCTC's done a lot of work with our partners on the international terrorism side. I think it's pretty clear that the processes look a lot alike in terms of using social media and the internet and so forth. And so we're broadening our aperture there and collectively writing at the unclassified and the FOUO so we can get that kind of information to our state and local partners. Where I think NCTC has particular value add is in some senses, domestic terrorism is a bit of a misnomer because of the international connections. And so we work a great deal with our partners around the globe because everyone is struggling with this problem right now and trying to figure out how to deal with it. And so we can bring a lot of analytic horsepower and potentially collection to the international problem set, and then in that regard, help the Bureau.
Thank you. And I see that I am over time. I don't know if the chair would like Director Wray to comment now or take it up another time.
Briefly?
Well, I think, I guess the short version would be that we are, in addition to everything that Director Travers has said, we are looking very hard at some trend of, for example, white supremacists or neo-Nazis here connecting through social media online with like-minded individuals overseas, and in some cases actually traveling overseas to train. And so, as Director Travers said, we are engaging a lot with our Five Eyes partners and others like that as we're comparing notes on this threat.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As you know, our country is facing many threats, so I thank all of the witnesses for being here today. Director Wray, I want to start by asking you about Rudy Giuliani, a close outside advisor and counsel to the President. Have you communicated with Mr. Giuliani since you were nominated as the FBI Director?
No.
And do you know if Mr. Giuliani holds any security clearance of any kind?
I don't know the answer to that.
And has Mr. Giuliani made any formal representations, at least to the Justice Department or the FBI, regarding his foreign relationships, business dealings, or conflicts of interest?
I'm not sure there's anything I could say on that here.
Is that because this is a confidential matter, or because you don't know, or because they don't exist?
That is in part because I don't know the answer for the whole FBI.
What's the other part?
Well, if there were something that were shared with some other part of the FBI that I'm not aware of, it might well run afoul of some of the other issues that you mentioned.
Okay. And given the close relationship between the President and Mr. Giuliani, has the FBI told the President whether his counsel is a potential counterintelligence threat?
I don't think there's anything that I can say on that subject.
I recall that you have testified in the past that you have taken an oath to defend the Constitution, and I admire the way that you have said that, and I do believe that to be true. Do you believe that your first oath is to the Constitution or to the President?
My loyalty is to the Constitution and to the people of this country.
And if an American acting on behalf of a foreign person was seeking to influence or interfere with an American election, would the FBI want to know about that?
Well, again, I don't want to be misunderstood as wading in and commenting on specific recent events, but just as a general matter, any information about potential interference with our elections by a foreign government or by anybody else is something the FBI would want to know about.
In sworn testimony before the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee in June, you said that you, quote, could not think of an instance where the President has directly or indirectly asked you to open an investigation of anyone. As of today, can you confirm or deny whether the President has ever asked you to open an investigation as to anyone?
Again, I can't think of an instance in which that has happened. We've certainly had discussions about, for example, domestic terrorism threats, foreign intelligence threats, nation states, things like that, but those have tended to be more about a threat in the aggregate as opposed to a specific individual or anything like that.
Has the President or anyone on his behalf suggested that the FBI start, stop, or limit the scope of any investigation?
Not that I can think of.
In your view, would it be improper for the FBI to launch, limit, or stop a criminal investigation at the request of the President or anyone at the White House?
Well, again, I'm not going to wade into specific people's conversations, but what I will say is that the FBI's obligation and my obligation and the obligation that I expect of all 37,000 men and women of the FBI is that we're going to conduct properly predicated investigations, continue properly predicated investigations, and complete properly predicated investigations.
So without referring to any specific investigation, in your view, would it be improper for the FBI to launch, limit, or stop a criminal investigation at the request of the President or at the request of anyone at the White House?
I think we should conduct our investigations based only on the facts and the law and the rules that govern us, and nothing else.
Okay, I'm going to take nothing else as meaning that you believe it would be improper to be asked by the White House or the President to engage in such conduct. Is that correct?
Well, again, I'm not going to wade into hypotheticals, but I think we're saying the same thing in the sense that I do not think that the FBI should be concluding or closing an investigation for any improper purpose.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more time, and you'll either answer it or you won't, clearly. But I'm asking you about what is ethically appropriate. Would it be ethically appropriate to launch, limit, or stop a criminal investigation at the request of the President or anyone at the White House?
I think there should be no opening of an investigation based on anything other than the facts and the law. That's my answer.
Thank you. To your knowledge, has the White House or any member of the administration ever directed or suggested that Attorney General Barr or any other member of the Justice Department start, stop, or limit the scope of a criminal investigation?
I can't speak to Attorney General Barr's communications with others.
And during your time at the Justice Department and given your extensive and noble career, have you ever encountered suspects or defendants who tried to intimidate witnesses?
Absolutely, and prosecuted some.
And why isn't witness intimidation a threat to the pursuit of justice?
Why isn't witness?
Why is it?
Oh, why is it? Okay, I was going to say I happen to believe that witness intimidation is a threat to, because investigations and prosecutions should be about the truth and pursuit of the truth, and if witnesses who have firsthand information can't and don't come forward, then that pursuit of the truth is frustrated and impeded. And
in June 2019, it was reported that hundreds of law enforcement officers around the country are in active members-only extremist Facebook groups. These groups include White Lives Matter, Ban the NAACP, Death to Islam Undercover. Can you tell me what work your agency has done to investigate any of these cases and to what degree of success?
I'm not aware of the specific report that you're referring to. As I think I mentioned in response to one of the earlier questions, we do have about 900, let's say, give or take at the moment, domestic terrorism type investigations. That's, of course, not counting our hate crimes investigations. And a huge chunk of those involve some degree of what one might call white supremacist ideology as the extremist ideology that's motivating the crime that we're investigating.
Thank you, Director, and thank you for your service.
Senator Scott.
I want to thank each of you for being here today. I want to thank Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters for putting this together. My focus today is on the FBI's ability to share domestic terrorism information and other violent information with local FBI offices and state and local law enforcement. Let me start by saying that the men and women of the FBI are dedicated public servants. They serve this country selflessly with no desire for praise or public recognition. I understand that the FBI gets very little credit for their success, nor do they seek credit. And I understand it's only the few instances of failure that get public attention and scrutiny. The FBI deserves praise for the work that they do every day to keep us safe. But I also have concerns with the failures that occurred before a series of shootings in Florida and the lack of after-action transparency on the part of the FBI. In the days following the senseless attack at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, I learned of repeated failures by the FBI to properly investigate and act on specific tips received about the shooter in the months leading up to the attack. Weeks before the shooting, a detailed warning about the shooter was received by the FBI National Call Center. The warning was never passed on to the South Florida Field Office for an investigation or to any state or local law enforcement. Months before that, the FBI was warned about the shooter through a comment on a YouTube video, which someone with the shooter's name stated that, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." I understand the FBI gets a high volume of tips, but it appears the FBI did nothing with this detailed information of an imminent threat. We're also aware of similar instances of pre-attack notifications received by the FBI regarding other attacks in Florida, including at the Fort Lauderdale Airport, the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, and the Tallahassee Yoga Studio. Since that time, I have repeatedly sought information from you, Director Wray, regarding the steps you've taken to hold accountable those within your agency responsible for those failures. I ask for two things. First, has anyone been held accountable? And second, what changes have been made to prevent this from happening again? So far, I've gotten very little information. As governor, when this happened, I asked for an explanation, and I was told nothing. I got no information back. And as a U.S. Senator, I was asked, I put together a letter and asked for information on accountability and what changes. Again, I got little information. Mr. Chairman, I do have, I want to enter in the record the correspondence I've received.
Without
I
objection.
sent and received.
Without objection.
The Parkland families have also told me that they have not gotten answers. So I'm asking today, has anyone from the FBI been held accountable for the failures that followed the attack at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas? How have they been held accountable, and what changes have been made? Look, I get it. The attack was 100% the fault of an evil person. It's not the responsibility for FBI, and people make mistakes. But the failure to act on specific information given to the FBI that could have stopped this evil person requires action to correct the errors. I recently introduced the TIPS Act, which will require the FBI to be more proactive with sharing information with local and state officials. I also like your feedback on that proposal. But the first, if you could just talk about Parkland.
Thank you, Senator. Well, first let me say that